Okay, so picture this. You're in a classroom, and the teacher, the most important teacher you'll ever have, is giving their final lecture. This isn't just any lecture. It's right before a test that's going to define everything. Well, that's kind of the atmosphere we're walking into with Matthew 25. This is it. This is Jesus' final, high-stakes teaching session before his death, and it's basically a final exam for anyone who wants to follow him. And this right here, this is the question that's driving the whole chapter. You have to remember, Jesus is on the brink of his own crucifixion. And with the time he has left, he tells 3 stories, 3 parables, that all point back to this one central challenge. It's urgent, it's really direct, and it sets the stage for everything that's about to unfold. Now, the setting for all this is so important. Jesus is on the Mount of Olives. The air is thick with tension. I mean, the religious leaders are literally plotting to kill him, and his own disciples are still kind of scratching their heads, not fully getting what's about to happen. And it's in this supercharged environment that he drops these final, really pointed questions. To really get these stories, we have to understand what a parable even meant back then. You know, we tend to think of them as these simple little fables with a nice, tidy moral at the end. But that's not it at all. Not even close. In the first century, parables were these sharp, disruptive stories designed to totally flip your world upside down. You know, the Greek word for parable, parabole, literally means to throw alongside. And a great way to think about it is like a curveball in baseball. It looks like it's coming straight at you, but then bam, it breaks in a totally unexpected direction. The whole point is to knock you off balance, to make you think, and to force you to make a decision. So as we dig into these 3 stories, just be ready for the curveball. All right, let's get to the first question on the exam. This one comes from the parable of the 10 virgins. Now, it's a story all about being prepared, but maybe not in the way you might think. The story itself seems pretty simple on the surface, right? You've got 10 bridesmaids waiting for the bridegroom. 5 of them are called wise because they brought extra oil for their lamps, and 5 are foolish because they didn't. The groom is super late, and when he finally shows up at midnight, the foolish ones are out of oil. They miss the party, and worse, the door is shut, locked. So here's the real lesson. The foolish virgins ask if they can borrow some oil, but the wise ones say no. Now, at first glance, that seems pretty selfish, doesn't it? But the idea here is that the oil represents something you can't just transfer from one person to another. It's things like a deep relationship with God, a spiritual readiness that you have to build up over a lifetime. It's a really powerful way of saying you simply cannot cram for this final exam. Okay, the second question. This one is even more of a challenge. It comes from the parable of the talents, and it's all about what we do with the things we've been given. We think of it as a story about stewardship, but really, it's a story about risk. First, let's just get the scale right here. A single talent was not just a little bit of cash. It was the absolute largest unit of currency back then. We're talking something like 20 years' wages for an average worker. So even the servant, who was only given 1 talent, was entrusted with a truly life-changing amount of money. This is not pocket change. And here it is. Here's the curveball. We modern readers, we look at that third servant and we think, oh, he's lazy. But to the original audience, his actions were totally responsible. In that culture, burying treasure was the safest, most legally protected way to guard it. If it got stolen, he wouldn't be held liable. He was playing it safe, totally by the book. So you'd think the master would be happy, right? The servant did the culturally right thing. He preserved the money and returned it all intact. But the master's reaction is, well, it's just shocking. He completely condemns him, calls him wicked and lazy. So why? Because the master is operating in a completely different economy. The message is just startling. Playing it safe is not a spiritual virtue. The kingdom of God isn't about just preserving the status quo. It's about taking courageous, faithful risks to multiply what God has invested in you. In this story, accomplishing nothing is the biggest failure of all. Okay, let's get to the final story, and you'll see how this all builds. This is the famous scene of the sheep and the goats, and it asks what might be the ultimate question. When you look out at the world, who do you actually see? The criteria for how people are separated at this final judgment is, well, it's stunningly clear. It has absolutely nothing to do with what religious group you belong to, or how much theology you know, or your social status. It's all about these tangible, concrete acts of compassion. Did you feed the hungry? Did you care for the sick? Did you welcome the person who is an outsider? But here's where it gets really, really profound. The righteous people, the sheep, They're genuinely confused by this. They're like, wait, when did we ever see you and do all this stuff for you? They have no memory of serving the king directly. They were just responding to human need wherever they saw it. And then, unbelievably, the condemned, the goats, they ask the exact same question. When did we see you hungry or sick and not help? The point is that neither group recognized Jesus. Both of them were totally blind to his presence in the poor and the marginalized. So what was the difference? It wasn't about recognition. It was about character. The righteous people didn't have some special Jesus detector. They had just built a character that instinctively, almost without thinking, responded to human suffering with compassion. And that, Jesus says, is what it looks like to serve him. So what's the answer key to this whole final exam? When you put all three of these curveball stories together, this really revolutionary picture of what it means to be a follower of Jesus starts to emerge. Let's just connect the dots here. The parable of the 10 virgins is all about active, long-term preparation. The parable of the talents demands courageous, productive action. And then the story of the sheep and goats shows us the goal, an instinctive, selfless compassion. See, it's not one or the other. True faith is all three of these woven together. And this right here is the big takeaway. Matthew 25 completely blows up our idea of what it means to wait for Jesus to return. It's not this passive thing, not some kind of spiritual hibernation where you just keep your head down. No, it's a call to be deeply engaged in the world, right here and now, actively preparing, courageously risking, and compassionately serving. Ultimately, what these stories do is pivot us away from just abstract beliefs and toward a concrete, lived-out faith. The final exam isn't going to be a multiple-choice test on your theology. It's going to be a portfolio review of your life, to see how what you said you believed actually translated into action, into risk, and into love. And that leaves us with the final, unavoidable question, doesn't it? The oil of readiness, you can't borrow it from someone else at the last minute. And the treasure of our potential, you can't just bury it in the ground to keep it safe. These are gifts we've been given. So the question Matthew 25 forces on every single one of us is personal. What are you doing with yours?